All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 28, Section 4, Popular Culture and Mass Media. So we got a very brief and very short section here, but I'll just go ahead and say a few things. So we're looking at 1950s culture. And one way that we can define it is that it is a culture of uniformity and conformity. You know, to conform to something means to kind of do what the majority of people are doing. However, there were some kind of pushbacks against that. One of it was rock and roll, which emerged as a style of music in the 1950s. This was a combination of country music and African American influences. And it became incredibly popular via the radio, which was a technology which had already been kind of laid down in the 1920s. But it promoted ideas related to youth rebellion, specifically against some of the conformity of the age. So a lot of themes of rock and roll music have to do with things like freedom, rebelling against authority, conformity, etc., etc. The most famous, of course, was Elvis Presley, the most famous rock and roll musician. You had others too, Chuck Berry, and there were other groups as well that kind of fed into this new type of music that was increasingly important. In terms of the film industry, Hollywood was really put on the defensive from the Cold War. The HUAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee, right, HUAC, investigated Hollywood during the Cold War, believing that it had been infiltrated by communists. Now, a lot of these public hearings required members of Hollywood to go before televised hearings in which they would be asked certain questions like, have you or are you a member of the Communist Party? Most people who really sought to kind of stay out of the fray cooperated, but a group of Hollywood, actors, directors, whatever, called the Hollywood 10, refused to answer questions. And they did so citing the Fifth Amendment, that it was a violation of one's rights. The Fifth Amendment is the amendment against self-incrimination. In other words, if you're accused of a crime, you don't have to do anything to prove your innocence. It's pretty much up to the other side to make that case. It's the case against self-incrimination. So the Hollywood 10, they refused to answer questions relating to communism and were ultimately, blacklisted and fired. This was part of the reason as to why the Red Scare had taken hold, was because there were people fearing for their jobs. They didn't want anything to do with this fact of being related to a communist. At the same time, though, you had a Supreme Court case, United States versus Paramount. This broke up. Broke up the Hollywood, I will say movie, monopoly. Previously, industries had a monopoly on the filmmaking process, the distribution process, the theater process. This Supreme Court case broke up a lot of those movie industries and really allowed for more creative movies to be created. So you had a lot more films being more innovative and ultimately more entertaining. But ultimately, the culture of the 1950s is marked by the television. Ownership by the 1960s, 50% of families owned a TV. And the TV was where you found your advertisements, your entertainment shows, your music programs. Americans spent on average, 6, 7, 8 hours a day watching TV. Even if you didn't own one, you would go to your neighbor's house and watch your neighbor's TV. And it was really through the television that kind of, major cultural trends. Leave It to Beaver, for example, was a TV show. So this was a TV show that portrayed American culture. So when it came to, that's not what the show was about, but that's ultimately what it ended up doing. When it came to questions about, how should men act in society? How should women act in society? How should families act in society? people took their cues from television, and these television shows were incredibly powerful in shaping the cultural attitudes of the entire country.